Kia ora, welcome everybody to the hearing on the private plan change. We'll reconvene the hearing. Can I'll just check, Tony is just checking that Miss Tepania and Mr. Mark Brown are online. Thank you very much, they're both here. I think Mr. Marston's coming in a little bit later. I'll just repeat what I've said yesterday. There are 4 commissioners, independent commissioners, Ms. Ratt and myself, Greg Hill, chairing the hearing. We're here. The other 2 commissioners, Ms. Tepania and Mr. Nigel Mark Brown, are coming in remotely. They're online and will be asking questions where they have questions. They are both have COVID and so are not here, as is Ms. Sweetman, who is the Section 42A author, so she's online as well. And so we just continue with the hearing with, in that part in person and part remote. We've got the schedule before us this morning, and I'll just call the next submitter, and it's Mr. Lorandi. Is he here? Thank you. Welcome, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Excellent. Kia ora. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, RMA commissioners, for your time and patience to be here this morning. Excuse me if I might mispronounce some words. English is not my first language, and so please interrupt me if you don't understand some of what I'm saying.
Thank you.
My name is Silvano Lorandi, and I'm an adopted Nelsonian. I'm a passionate mountaineer. I'm a member of the Nelson Search and Rescue Team, and I'm a licensed builder. I wanted to speak here today because I feel that what is being discussed could have a strong negative impact on my future and the future of my whānau. It could affect me and my family in terms of loss of amenity, noise, pollution, and hazards due to the traffic. I often walk in the area from the center of New Zealand and along the ridgeline to a place called Te Whenua, where families bury the placenta of newborn babies in a gesture to reconnect to the land. It's right in front of Kaka Valley. Then I continue to a viewpoint, which I think is called Branford Hill, and it's marked 0.87 on the topo map. It's a lovely spot with a well-established olive grove. From there, I admire the space and tranquility in front of me of Kaka Valley. In search and rescue, we love valleys because they spread the sound efficiently for long distances. And this helps us to locate the missing party who might be calling for help. If this development goes ahead, the noise generated will travel far in the whole Maitahi Valley, affecting the natural experience that many citizens have enjoyed for years around the river tracks and Branford Park. This area has really improved in the years, thanks to locals and city council efforts. There are better paths, good playing areas, new bathrooms, lots of planting. It's a place that has been really well looked after for the benefit of the community of whole of Nelson. The area most used, Sunday Hall and the playing fields, will become noisy with the sound of construction, traffic, and then the urban sounds that come from 1,000 new people living in Kaka Valley. The project that we are discussing is basically urban growth, and this cannot be simply hidden behind a line of trees in front of the Kaka Valley. I oppose this project because it's going to spoil that unique aspect of Nelson as a city where kids are able to bike from the center of town to rural environment in 3 kilometers. In which other medium-sized city in New Zealand can you do that? I oppose this project because of the traffic that it's going to generate. The intersection between Now Street and Maitahi Valley Road is a hotspot where there are often infractions of the road code with low levels of traffic. The narrow intersection between Now Street and Tasman Street will become the meeting point of two important valleys, the Brook and the Maitahi, and it's already dangerous now for children walking to Nelson Central School and pedestrians. I oppose it because as a builder, I don't understand why in New Zealand 2022, where in the building industry there is constant talk about the need to redesign the way we build, with mid-rise buildings, intensification of urban living. Here we are practically still thinking about developing like many, many years ago. I heard the other day in the applicant's presentation that this urban project dates back to 1977. That's 45 years ago. What did we know in 1977 about climate change, loss of space, degradation of the quality of the water, poisonous algae in the Maitahi River? We are here re-evaluating a failed urban development of 45 years ago. I oppose this project because it would pollute the river and the bush surrounding it. It could spoil an entire rural valley, its stream, and consequently, the most important river of Nelson, the Maitahi. A brand statistic, brands being Building Research Association New Zealand, estimates that to build a standard 3-bedroom house generates between 3,000 and 4,000 kilograms of rubbish, 3 or 4 tons. Treated timber, paint, solvents, microplastic, plastic wrappings. Not all of this rubbish is ending up in the landfill. Some will be dropped on the ground, buried, picked up by the wind, and spread far and away. The building industry is a polluting industry, pernicious pollution. Painters washing their paintbrushes at the end of a working day in the grass. This happens every day on every house that is being built. Paint going into the soil. It's legal to do so. I wish the soil could talk about the legality of it. And the quantity of paint left in a roller brush is actually quite significant. Treated timber, regularly cut and machined on site, generating sawdust spread by the wind and therefore not visually quantifiable. Because if it was properly collected, it amounts to buckets of sawdust every day for parts of the building process, for every house. Treated timber, which is loaded with copper, chrome, and arsenate, 2 heavy metals and a poisonous element, arsenic. We're going through a period of building material shortage. The solution? Plastic. More and more plastic is being used in the building industry now than ever before. Plasterboard shortage? They are advertising plastic lining now. Unfortunately, all plastic used on the building industry needs to be cut, machinally cut, ground, generating plastic sawdust that flies away in the wind. Microplastics that would end up in the Maitahi. Containing sediments running off from excavated building sites is easy to manage in the sediment plan on paper, but it's very hard to contain on site, especially during storms and as the job drags on and the sediment barriers get clogged up. And this development that we are talking about, it's a huge development with a lot of houses. I conclude. Environmental generational amnesia is the idea that each generation perceives the environment into which it's born, no matter how developed, urbanized, or polluted, as the norm. If we could step back in time and just observe how much we have lost in terms of space, fish life, bird life, quality of the water, we will not be considering any further activity that could harm the land we live on. Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions, Ms. Red?
No questions from me, thank you. Thank you for coming along and presenting to us. Similar message to what we were receiving from submitters yesterday, so thank you for that.
And same for me. Thank you very much again. I think what you have done is added to all the other submissions that we've heard from in a similar vein, that you don't support, you oppose this proposal for the reasons you've set out, so it's very clear to us. Thank you very much.
Good. Thanks to you. Have a nice day.
Yeah. And Mr. Thompson's next. Now, just when we are recording this, so if you're standing, which is fine, can you just stand by a microphone and we'll just make sure it's been picked up? Thank you. If you start talking, I'll just check with with Tony that you're being recorded. Okay.
Good morning. Tēnā koutou, ko Ron Thompson, toka wingoa.
So can I just stop again? Can you hear? Is he recording? And
I'll sit down if you like.
can everybody hear Mr. Thompson is probably the key issue too. Thank you. Right. Thank you. Sorry.
Ko Ron Thompson, toka wingoa. Ngā mihi maha kia koutou katoa I whiriwhiri whakaaro ana mō tēnei kaupapa nunui. I first want to make it clear that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not in a professional or any other capacity. Our family has lived in Nelson for over 20 years. When we first moved here, our children were young teenagers. We'd lived overseas for 10 years, and so we set about exploring the town we had chosen to move to. So my first memory of the Maitahi Valley is in that context. We discovered that 10 seconds after leaving the houses of Nile Street, we were in the country. Wide, green, open spaces with fields and hills to the left and right, and a river on one side. And as we explored further, we discovered the back half of the Botanical Reserve, Branford Park with its beautiful trees, the Maitahi cricket ground, the picnic and barbecue areas by the riverside, and the three main swimming holes, Black Holes, Denny's Hole and Sunday Hole. We were gobsmacked by the space, the green, the calm and the lack of traffic. What foresight the city fathers must have had, we thought, to set aside so close to the city centre such a wonderful place for the enjoyment of its citizens. And people do enjoy it. Go to Branford Park and the recreation areas by the river, and the noise there is not of traffic, but of families playing family games, and in summer the sounds of laughing and splashing. Nelsonians use the parkland and the river all the time for their recreation, for walking their dogs or just walking, tossing frisbees, playing cricket, picnicking and swimming. And of course, in recent years, the number of cyclists using Nile Street and the Maitahi Valley Road has increased enormously as they head off up to the trails in the Upper Maitahi. It's not overstating it to say that the Maitahi Valley is actually one of Nelson's precious taonga, and the farm that fills the Carcass Valley is part of this taonga. It is rural, it is quiet, it is green, it is traffic-free. Surely the past leaders of our community, the same leaders who set aside and developed Branford Park, the cricket ground and the swimming and picnic areas, surely those leaders also deliberately kept Carcass Valley green and distanced from development because they appreciated its value as open space, forming the background to the public parks. The fact that in 2022 it is still part of that background and is zoned rural demonstrates that our city founders and those who have come subsequently have valued it as a very special place. It saddens me that the current council could even contemplate allowing Carcass Valley to be urbanised. How horrified their predecessors, men and women whose foresight gave us this special place, how disappointed those earlier councillors would be to see it dominated by houses and traffic. As I said in my initial written submission, great cities preserve greenscapes close to their centres because they're seen as essential to people's health and well-being. In other parts of New Zealand, look at the Green Belt in Wellington, Cornwall Park and One Tree Hill Reserves in Auckland, and all the regional parks surrounding the city. When Nelson is a much bigger city, as it will become, with infill housing and significantly bigger population, green spaces like the Maitahi Valley will be deeply appreciated and valued. I would hope that this council and the commissioners can see that, and then have the foresight that our city founders had, and keep it from further development. If it is developed, it will be gone forever, and future generations of Nelsonians will shake their heads in amazement that it was allowed to happen. And not only, and this is important, not only would the Carcass Valley be gone forever, but so also would the peace and quiet and calm of the current parkland around Brantford Park. In my original submission, I also recorded my prediction that if the development proceeds, then within a year or two of the inevitable traffic increases, there will be pressure to cut down the trees that line Nile Street in order to widen it. Already it's a narrow, constrained road. We will then lose the only avenue of trees we have in Nelson. So I stand by that prediction, and I'm deeply saddened by it. I know that many other speakers and submitters will have described the impacts of this development on traffic flows, on noise levels and water quality, and I support those submissions. But for me, as with many other individual submitters, I wanted to tell you today how much our family and countless other families enjoy the recreation areas in the Maitahi Valley. With our family, that enjoyment has extended over 20 years. I have deep admiration and respect for previous councils who have shaped the lower valley into the parkland we have today and allowed Carcass Valley to remain unspoiled. I hope it will remain the green and calm space that it currently is for future generations. I implore the council and the commissioners to see the area for what it is, one of Nelson's most precious taonga. So that's all I'm going to say today, but I thought I'd finish with a little Maori proverb which translates as, although people will perish, the land will remain. Whatu ngaro ngaro te tangata toitu te whenua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Just one question for me, just interestingly, when you say when Nelson is a bigger city with infill housing and significantly bigger population, is it your view that all of Nelson's growth, I mean, I think you suggest that it will grow, that it all should be infilling, or do you think there does need to be some further greenfield expansion?
I think there will inevitably be some greenfield expansion, but I think there are probably better areas. The Carcass Valley, we go there a lot. The slopes down to the valley are on the south side, essentially. South side, yes, yeah, would be. And the valley floor is really quite a cold valley. The Maitahi Valley is a cold valley. But then if you look across town, if you look to, say, the land above Amano Street, going up to Prince's Drive, there's a big green area there that I believe is being developed, and that's much more suitable in my view because it's sunny and it's, the contours are better. So I think there will be scope for more greenfield development, but I just think the trouble with the Carcass Valley development is that it will not only spoil the Carcass Valley, it will also spoil the reserve that we have at the moment. The peace and quiet of that will be gone too.
Thank you, very clear. Thank you, Ms. Reid. Anything from you? No? Again, very clear statement. Thank you very much. The next submitters is Friends of the Maitahi and Mr. Gray, and calling Dr. Young as a witness, so they'd like to come forward.
So is this on, total, just default?
Yes,
Okay. Right.
if the little red light's on, it's working.
Okay, great. Thank you. Kia ora. My name is Stephen Gray. I'm one of the fortunate few to live in Nelson with a bird's eye view of the Maitahi River from my living room and kitchen. I've lived near, swum in, and closely watched the river for 24 years. Today I'm presenting as one of the Friends of the Maitahi, a community environmental group advocating for the protection and improvement of the Maitahi or Maitahi River. Since 2014, Friends of the Maitahi has been conducting monthly river monitoring, fortnightly riparian planting and weeding, lobbying, particularly related to the impact of pine forestry on river health, and education on river ecology. We have 350 members on our mailing list and have been active in the local debate on how best to protect and improve the river. Nelson is fortunate to have a significant river running through the city. The Maitahi, or Maitahi, is the source of our drinking water and supports eels, whitebait, the occasional trout, and a reasonable population of invertebrates. Does the water quality need to be improved? Absolutely. While industrial forestry is the biggest threat, and extending urban development upstream further threatens water quality and river ecology. This is the focus of our submission, and as we seek assurance that if the development goes ahead, it should maintain the amenity value of the Maitahi River, improve the water quality in the river, ensure that no impact of sediment and stormwater on river, and ensure there is no impact of sediment and stormwater on river ecology and the associated habitat, and require future subdivisions within the PPC to be subject to the strictest resource consents. We recommend that Plan Change 28 be rejected unless strict, robust, and measurable provisions are in place to protect the water quality of the Maitahi River during the construction phase, and that long-term solutions are in place to ensure runoff from the subdivision does not harm the river. One of the biggest problems with this PPC is the lack of information on how flood risk will be managed. Changes to the floodplain, additional stormwater flows, and increased severe weather events mean the flood risk downstream is inevitably greater. The plan change does not sufficiently address these issues and their potential impacts. The plan change does not include sufficient detail on how sediment will be dealt with, or how it will meet the requirements of the NPS on fresh water. As outlined in the advice from Cawthron Institute, a comprehensive sediment erosion management plan for the proposed development is necessary, given the high risk of erosion and sediment runoff into the waterways. As noted in the supporting advice from Cawthron, we ask that the Carcass stream realignment and other changes to the Maitahi River floodplains during construction should not increase flood risk or have any negative impact on the ecology and natural character of the Maitahi River. Also, the water quality and river ecology is protected from sediment and other pollutants once all construction is completed. The old paradigm of thinking about river ecology has been replaced. We no longer believe that each significant rain event will clean the fine sediment out of the riverbed. We now understand that rivers have limits in terms of sediment. They can absorb, in terms of the sediment they can absorb, and we have to actively work to improve river ecology. The status quo isn't good enough. Continuous river improvement is the new paradigm. Our challenge with this PPC is that sediment from the construction phase of this development will be significant. Any sediment mitigation strategies during construction must be able to handle the runoff of water and heavy metals that come from cars and trucks using dirt roads, so sediment and other pollutants are absorbed before they reach the Carcass stream or the Maitahi River. While we believe it is possible to prevent sediment and heavy metals from coming into the river during construction, it's difficult to have confidence in our local council to adequately monitor and catch these problems during the construction phase. We recently saw our council fail to protect Maury Stream residents from developers inadequately protecting their waterway from construction erosion. As a result, we must trust the developers have the capacity to take the necessary steps to protect and preserve the water quality and river ecology. This is also a challenge, as the developers have not yet published enough information on the specific measures they will have in place to protect water quality, river ecology, and the amenity value of swimming holes adjacent to and downstream from the subdivision. The lack of detail on how and when sediment traps, protective berms, and other river protection measures will be in place makes it impossible to have confidence the developers know what they're doing. Their poor track record on sediment control and on the Bayview side of the hill only adds to our lack of confidence in their ability to contain sediment runoff. Since critical aspects of the development are not detailed or supported by technical information at this stage, there are no clear and effective controls on how erosion will be handled. This leaves the council in a difficult position and places considerable uncertainty on whether subsequent detailed development consents would be approved and adequately monitored. As a result, we ask that should PPC 28 proceed, all future subdivisions and buildings within Kaka Valley Bayview be subject to the strictest resource consents and widely notified to the public. The river and river valley are important to Nelsonians of all ages. The river valley provides ready access to nature, something which science is telling us is vital to well-being. Older people use this area for peaceful walks and drives. Fit adults and teens use it for active recreation. And for kids, the river just provides a place to creatively muck about, make dams, float boats, and test themselves by leaping into the water from a rope swing. Friends of the Maitahi are asking this panel to decline PPC 28 unless they can be certain all the attributes of the river and valley are protected or enhanced during the construction phase and into the future. Finally, we want to thank you on behalf of the community for the thoughtful, comprehensive, and considerate manner in which you've been considering this matter. So, cheers.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. I think what we'll do, we should hear from Dr. Young first, and then we'll come back with questions which might be directed to either of you and to determine who's the most appropriate to ask it. So, Dr. Young.
Morena koutou, ko Roger Young tuku ingoa. I prepared evidence in chief dated 27th of June 2022. My qualifications and experience are provided in my evidence in chief. I confirm I will continue to comply with the Code of Conduct for Expert Witnesses in giving this summary. I've been asked by friends of the Maitahi to prepare evidence on water quality and aquatic ecology issues associated with the proposed private plan change request sought for the Maitahi Bayview development. Starting on the existing environment, the Maitahi or Maitahi River is highly valued by the Nelson community and supports a variety of aquatic life. However, a detailed review of water quality, hydrology and ecological information from the Maitahi River catchment identified some specific concerns about the lower river, where there are increased inputs in fine sediment, decreased water clarity, warm water temperatures, higher nitrate-nitrogen concentrations, higher periphyton biomass, regular blooms of toxic cyanobacteria, and higher concentrations of fecal indicator bacteria compared to the upper river. Sensitive macroinvertebrates like mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies are absent or rare in the lower river, and macroinvertebrate community index scores are indicative of impacted ecosystem health. Water quality and stream health appears to be poor in the small streams along the Atawhai Hills that are monitored, with high concentrations of fecal bacteria and nutrients, and the macroinvertebrate communities present in these streams are also indicative of poor ecological health. The Maitahi River and small Atawhai streams drain into Nelson Haven and eventually Tasman Bay. These coastal areas are highly valued for their aesthetic appeal, rich biodiversity, shellfish collection, aquaculture, swimming, fishing, boating, and scientific appeal. Key threats to the Nelson Haven are elevated muddiness caused by sediment runoff from urban and rural catchment areas, and localised sediment toxicity and eutrophication or nutrient over-enrichment at urban stream mouths entering the haven. These threats are also relevant to Tasman Bay, which is affected by fine sediment deposited near the river mouths. For example, sediment has been implicated in the decline of the scallop fishery in Tasman Bay. In summary, the proposed development drains into highly valued and sensitive waterways that are already experiencing the effects of sedimentation, contaminants, and warm water temperatures. Any development needs to be done with extreme care to avoid exacerbating these stresses.
Dr. Young, can I just step in? Sorry, is this I'm just not sure what you're reading from. Is that a summary?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's right. I was trying to follow with the ongoing evidence, and I assumed it was a summary, and I wasn't
Yeah,
quite.
I sent the summary. I've got copies of the summary, hard copies if you like, or I've also sent
No,
it
that's
to
good. No, it's fine.
council last night.
Thank you.
I agree with Mr Parsonson that fine sediment resulting from erosion and runoff from the Carcass stream catchment will eventually be flushed downstream and is unlikely to fill in Denny's Hole. However, that sediment will add to the sediment issues already faced within the lower reaches of the Maitahi River, Nelson Haven and Tasman Bay. On to typical issues associated with the health of urban streams. Throughout the world, urban streams are often associated with what's been described as an urban stream syndrome, with symptoms typically including an unnaturally variable flow regime, i.e. bigger floods and extreme low flows, high concentrations of nutrients and contaminants, elevated water temperatures, altered channel morphology and a reduced diversity of aquatic life. This international pattern is consistent with what is seen in New Zealand and Nelson, with streams draining urban areas typically having issues with sediment, nutrients, pathogens and other contaminants such as heavy metals. Macroinvertebrate communities in these urban waterways are typically indicative of poor ecosystem health. In summary, urban development has a consistent set of effects globally on waterways draining these urban areas. Considerable mitigation efforts and careful management will be required to avoid the symptoms of urban stream syndrome becoming apparent in the Carcass stream and other waterways influenced by the development. Moving on to potential effects associated with the proposed development. Reports prepared on behalf of the applicants provide a good summary of the potential aquatic ecological effects of the proposed Maitahi Bayview development. In my opinion, key potential effects include erosion and sediment input to downstream waterways, runoff of urban contaminants and input to downstream waterways, changes to the flow regime, loss of stream habitat, degradation of habitat quality. On to adequacy of information provided. I understand that there is a two-stage process, a plan change request followed by specific resource consent applications before any development can proceed. I also recognise that detailed specification and assessment of effects will be required during the resource consent process, but I consider that sufficient information is needed now at the plan change stage to determine whether the size and scope of the proposed mitigation tools can be implemented and if they will be sufficient to address the potential effects. At this stage, the likely effectiveness of the proposed mitigation efforts is unclear to me. Next section, the Esplanade Reserve is not a silver bullet. Section X.7 of the application, that's the Schedule X, requires that an Esplanade Reserve with a minimum total width of 40 metres shall be vested in stages as subdivision progresses. I am concerned that this Esplanade Reserve, also called the blue-green spine, is considered a silver bullet that will address most of the concerns associated with the development, as well as provide a walking cycling track. I think this is unrealistic. In my opinion, it is not appropriate to locate the proposed stormwater treatment wetlands within the Esplanade Reserve. Additional areas would need to be set aside for this purpose. Moving on to Schedule X.9, Best Practice Principles. Schedule X.9 of the application lists a series of best practice principles that shall be used to avoid or reduce the effects of the development on ecological values in Carcass stream and downstream waterways. I agree with the aims of these high-level principles, although as noted in the Ecology Joint Witness Statement, I consider that X.9 should also apply to the entirety of the structure plan area, refer to the mandatory fish passage requirements of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and the National Environmental Standard for Freshwater, avoid impervious surfaces and structures within 5 metres of Carcass stream, avoid or minimise adverse effects of urbanisation and stream loss, allow for an alternative to the realignment of Carcass stream as an enhancement opportunity, include erosion and sediment control management and vegetation clearance, ensure there is a link to the stormwater management plans. I note that there is now a specific reference to the need for a stormwater management plan in an updated version of Schedule X that was appended to Mr Lyle's further evidence. Moving on to realignment of the lower reaches of Carcass stream. The proposed realignment of the lower reaches of Carcass stream is described as an ecological enhancement activity, but it is also integrated with requirements to accommodate peak flows and protect the proposed adjacent development areas from potential flooding. The lower reach of Carcass stream is heavily modified and provides low-quality habitat to stream life currently. As discussed in the Ecology Joint Witness Statement, ecological enhancement of Carcass stream may be achieved without needing to realign the lower reaches of the waterway. My final section on additional information provided by the applicant. The structure plan provided with the plan change application included very little detail, so it was impossible to determine the location of roading and housing, where earthworks will occur, the likely scale of issues like erosion and sediment export, where the biggest risk areas were likely to be located, and if proposed mitigation options like wetlands and stormwater retention ponds were large enough or in the right location to address the risks. A more detailed structure plan has been developed in response to concerns raised at the expert witness conferencing. This addresses some of the issues raised, but the scale and location of earthworks is still unclear. A stormwater management plan has also now been prepared. The stormwater management plan provides further discussion of high-level best practice principles, but there is no specific information on where earthworks are likely to occur or the likely effectiveness of proposed mitigation measures for controlling sediment loss and discharges to downstream waterways. After reviewing the plan, I'm still left wondering if best practice mitigation is sufficient to address the increased risk of sediment discharges to downstream waterways. In addition, the stormwater management plan does not appear to include any monitoring requirements, either pre or post-development, any water quality or other standards that need to be met, and does not highlight consequences of any breaches to such limits or standards if they were to occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for that summary. Questions? Ms. Redd, do you have questions?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gray and Dr. Young. Thank you for a very clear summary of your expert evidence. First, just a quick question for Mr. Gray. One thing that you mentioned in your presentation was a poor track record for sediment control on the Bayview development. We have had evidence presented by the applicant that the Bayview development has very robust sediment control practices and management. Can you just explain a little more what your issues are with the Bayview development?
Especially when that development started, there were significant sediment flows that were noticed going into the haven. And so this is I think the challenge in general for the council in these developments. Typically a flow will happen and it's only after the fact that you see it and you notice it, and then people react to it. And I think in that case it resulted in some change of practice, which is a good thing. But the problem is that the flow did happen. And so, I think often it's the challenge of going into a situation that might look similar to past situations that the developers encountered, but each of these situations are unique and different, and I think you've heard testimony to that effect, especially with this valley. And so I think it's that balance between trying to get enough information to make an informed decision. And I think that's where we're stuck. We think their intentions sound good, it sounds great, but those flows early on in the Bayview side of things knocked us back in terms of our confidence on them. So we want to trust them, but we don't.
Thank you. That clarifies that for me. Understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I would like to acknowledge the great work that Friends of the Maitahi and others are doing in the Maitahi Valley. Thank you for that outline of your work. Dr. Young, perhaps following on from the comment around sedimentation risks and the like, You acknowledge that there are a number of practices that the applicant indicates it will put in place to manage flow of sediment and contaminants into Carcass stream and hence into the Maitahi. You comment in your letter that was submitted with the Friends of the Maitahi submission that these are all good. You identify identification, protection and management of wetlands, installation of stormwater detection ponds, treatment of first flush of stormwater flows, requirements regarding use of pervious pavement, requirements for rainwater storage tanks, maintenance of fish passage. These are all good mitigation initiatives and they should help to reduce the potential effects of the proposed development. However, the effectiveness of some low-impact urban design initiatives remains uncertain because they have not yet been adopted widely or strategically enough to assess their effects on receiving streams. So my question for you really is, if the applicant put in all the best management practices and that they identify and will be identified, is it feasible that will prevent the flow of sediments and contaminants into the stream?
Yeah, I think those...
I realise you're not a
Yeah.
expert in stormwater management.
No, those tools and methods are certainly a range of good things and they are applied around the country to manage sediment. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a stormwater engineer or an urban design expert, so I'm not familiar with how effective those are, and the sediment stormwater management plan doesn't comment on the effectiveness of them. It focuses on application of best management practices and it talks about minimising sediment losses. It doesn't talk about elimination of them. I realise the scale of rainfall and things is related. There's a risk, it's a risk management matter, and the larger the rainfalls, the larger the storms, the bigger the risk of considerable sediment loss from the area. But I would like to have seen in the stormwater management plan some indication of the likely effectiveness. The small amount of literature review I've done on this suggests there's a variable effectiveness of these tools. Obviously the scale of these tools, wetland treatment, stormwater detention ponds, is heavily influences the effectiveness of them. I noted in the stormwater management plan, I think it was, the scale of rain gardens and downstream wetlands considered for as part of the management, and I noted that was around 0.5% to just under 1% of the area of the different catchments that were being protected. So again, I looked at the Tasman Nelson urban development plan to see, well, is 1%, is that considered sufficient? There was no information there for me to state that, but it seems like a small part of the catchment is being relied on to manage sediment runoff from the vast majority of the catchment, so I would say there's a risk of that.
Thank you. And sort of along the same lines, I guess, you mentioned monitoring and setting of water quality standards. Are you aware of developments around the country where there has been monitoring of the effectiveness of these techniques of managing stormwater? I'm not an expert in urban development by any means. The closest example that I have locally was the Lee Dam development, and for example during the construction of that dam development there was considerable monitoring both upstream and downstream, and standards applied in terms of the macroinvertebrate community composition, deposited sediment on the riverbed, and water clarity, that standards that were required during the construction, and there's been monitoring of those requirements throughout the construction phase. And have you seen any evidence of the impacts of that development on the Lee Valley further down, or the Waimea River system? There's been monitoring of it, and I understand that most of the time they've been below those standards. I think sometimes they've breached these standards on occasions. Thanks. So are there accepted water quality standards for urban development, urban streams that could be applied in this case?
I think it's not. I think it's standards in relation to river health that I would be focusing on. So things like water clarity, deposited sediment in the riverbed, the health of the river as measured by the macroinvertebrate community composition. They would be obvious things to be measured. With urban development particularly, there's a risk of contaminants like heavy metals off roofs and roads. And so those are additional measures that could be incorporated in urban development planning.
But are there, if you looked at those measures, are there standards against which you would measure that and say that's acceptable or that's not?
Yes, there's the ANZEC standards and updated. The National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management includes a large range of attributes and associated with maintaining freshwater ecosystem health.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the esplanade and the sort of perspective that it's the silver bullet. In the revised structure management plan, there is now an extensive area, particularly on the eastern side of Carcass Stream, up the area up Carcass Hill, and also in the upper Carcass Stream on the true right of the stream, so the western side, which now has a rural revegetation overlay. Would that help meet your concerns that it's not that there is too much focus on the riparian strip being the solution to the problem?
Yes, I was pleased to see that. I think in the earlier stages of the application, the green spine seemed to be the primary area for everything: biodiversity, stormwater treatment, shading of the stream, providing walking tracks and cycling tracks, and it seemed unrealistic. So I think it is important that other areas, the principles talked about in the stormwater management plan were distributed small-scale wetlands and greenfield gardens and treatment, and I support that. I think a distributed treatment framework across the catchment and the areas where it's needed is definitely a better approach than relying on the riparian margin to do all that treatment.
So your concerns about the reliance on the riparian margin have been at least eased? Have they been?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Okay. Do you have remaining concerns other than that you've already talked about in terms of the uncertainty?
Really, it's the scale of that, and I noted that the rain gardens was, as I said before, about 0.5% of the catchment area. The wetlands were just under 1%, and that was considered one or the other, not both, in the stormwater management plan. So, I would question, is that a large enough scale to actually treat runoff? Less than 1% of the catchment area treating runoff from the other 99%.
Moving on to the Carcass Stream realignment, it has been presented to us that there is a natural flow channel that goes down the western side of the floodplain, and that from an ecological perspective that would actually be a better ecological outcome, in particular because there is current shading, and also that in the context of the development, the stream could be diverted into that channel before the floodplain works are done, so it would be a less invasive and lower risk than leaving the stream in its current flow. Any comments from you on that?
Yes, the lower reaches of Carcass Stream are clearly quite modified. The current habitat in the stream provides low quality habitat. I visited the site with the applicants a few months ago and noted there was some evidence of a historic channel along that western boundary. When flows went down there, I don't know. There will be a modest reduction in stream length if it was realigned to that western boundary from what the current stream channel is. There is an opportunity to improve the habitat quality in the lower reach without realigning it. It could be improved where it is. And yeah, the only evidence or the only suggestion that there would be an ecological benefit of moving it would be there's a steep bank on the western side, and that might provide some shading from northerly aspect from that bank and any vegetation that's on that bank. I think, yeah, I agree there is some benefits to that, but it's relatively minor. And I think the expectations around the ecology that can be developed in that lower river need to be realistic. It will dry up occasionally, and so yeah, it won't be a thriving biodiversity hotspot for Nelson, even after efforts to improve the habitat.
Would you expect that you would get, I mean, this may be a hydrology question, and if that's not, so if you're not comfortable answering, that's fine, but would you expect to get more consistent flow down that lower section of the stream with riparian plantings, better revegetation of the valley than you do at the moment?
Be mixed, I think, with the urban. Looking again at the stormwater management plan, there was talk about around different subcatchments with different amounts of impervious surface, but some of those were around 50%, and I think the average was 25% impervious surface for the Carcass catchment. So a result from that would be, or an unmitigated result from that would be higher floods and low flows. The applicant is obviously proposing stormwater retention and wetlands and things and revegetation of some areas. So there's two contrasting things going on there. I don't know what the balance of that would be. Yeah, they would counteract each other to some extent.
I think I'm coming towards the end of my questions for you. Other commissioners may have other questions. The riparian stream buffers, you mentioned that you would like to see a minimum of 20 metres each side, but acknowledging that there may be some constraints in terms of the topography where that's not possible. And then I think you also comment on walking and cycling paths no less than 5 metres from the stream. Any further comment on that? How important is that? Why?
I think you've got I think the 40 metre riparian width is appropriate. That's a good. Obviously, it depends on the steepness of the slopes that are being relied upon, or that the riparian zone is essentially acting as a filter to the stream of. That's a reasonable width. In an ideal world, I think it would be good to specify that is evenly placed on both sides of the stream to ensure that both sides of the stream are protected, but I do recognise that there's topography elements, and it may be counterproductive to try and meet a 20 metres on each side requirement when it's much better to have more on one side and slightly less on the other. And yes, I think it's important to not allow impervious areas close to the stream in terms of surface runoff directly into the stream.
Okay, thanks. I think that's all the questions that I have for now.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very much.
And we can always come back to with others. Mr. Mark Brown, do you have questions of Dr. Young?
Yes, I
do that.
Oops.
Can you hear me?
Not very well, it's a very unstable.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Mark Brown, but you're not very clear. Just start again, and
Can you hear me talking?
we can now, thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Young.
Morning.
My first question, sorry, Dr. Young, my first question relates to your need for monitoring of the river to assess the effects of urbanisation. So are you talking about the Carcass stream or the Maitahi River or both?
I think both are appropriate. The effects will become most apparent most quickly in the Carcass stream, but the values that are highest are really in the Maitahi River itself and downstream. And I think both need to be measured, and there needs to be information before the development that can be compared with any post-development monitoring results.
Are there not real practical difficulties in doing that with the Maitahi River, where you've got a much larger upstream with all sorts of effects from that catchment, and you're trying to pick up an effect from a much smaller sub-catchment coming in? I mean, how practical would it be to do that in your view?
Yes, I acknowledge that the discharges from the Carcass stream are only part of what's coming down the Maitahi catchment itself, but I think it would be useful to see if you could have an upstream, downstream type monitoring approach and see if any changes in the composition of the riverbed, for example, upstream of Carcass Valley versus downstream, if there was a significant increase in the amount of fines in the riverbed downstream but not upstream. I think that would give you confidence that there was the change might be associated with the Carcass stream activities.
Okay, thank you. You, in your paragraph 27 of your evidence, you said it's not appropriate to put stormwater treatment wetlands in Esplanade Reserve areas. Can you just elaborate why that is the case?
It's not that I don't think they're appropriate. I think it probably is appropriate to have some stormwater management in adjacent in the lower part of the valley, adjacent to or capturing runoff from side catchments. But I think that shouldn't be the only place where stormwater management occurs, and I support the applicant's updated stormwater management plan and a distributed network of stormwater management throughout the catchment, trying to treat it at source rather than relying on sort of ambulance at the bottom of the cliff approaches right next to the stream. So once there are large volumes, it's very hard to treat. So I think the distributed small rain gardens and small wetlands distributed throughout the catchments is a much better approach than relying only on stormwater management along the riparian margins of Carcass stream.
Okay, thank you. Now turning to water quality, stormwater quality, in terms of nutrients, would it be your view that the nutrient load from the Carcass stream after urbanisation and after stormwater management devices are in place would be less than is occurring now, or could you not offer an opinion one way or the other?
It's hard to say. I don't know what level of, the stocking in there at the moment is relatively extensive. It's not a heavily stocked area. I'm not sure if fertiliser is applied in that area. There was a lot of gorse that may have been, gorse as a legume, and may be putting nitrogen into the system. A lot of that has been removed. I imagine after urbanisation there'll be gardens. Some of the areas will have gardens and they'll be fertilising those gardens. The general pattern with urban streams is relatively high nutrient concentrations from urban streams maybe not as high as some rural streams, but they are still elevated compared to forested streams.
Okay, thank you. Now we heard from Mr. Suljic from Save the Maitahi expert evidence that he mentioned some possible concern about microplastics in stormwater. Can you offer any comment on that, please?
Yes, one of my colleagues is an expert on microplastics and the effect of that. It appears to be wherever you look you find microplastics in the environment, and it is an issue that we should be concerned about. I'm not, I guess it's where is the sources of those things. If there's more people living in an area, there might be more microplastics being sourced in an urban area than a rural area. I'm not sure on that. It would depend. One of the witnesses earlier this morning talked about the use of plastics in the building industry. I'm not familiar with that,
yes.
But if that's a large element in building now, and if there are sawdust or plastic sawdust, essentially that would contribute to that issue.
And is there still considerable uncertainty about what the adverse effect of such microplastics that might get in from the proposed development are, what those effects might be? Is that quite uncertain?
Yeah, there are a range of effects. I understand that microplastics leach various chemicals out of them. That's probably a bigger effect, the leaching of chemicals from the plastics rather than the plastics themselves. And the smaller they are, the bigger surface area they have, and the more leaching of those plasticizers and things. That's the effect of that. There are a range of effects on organisms, from endocrine disruption and other effects.
Would you see that stormwater, or earthworks management and stormwater management for this area specifically need to address microplastics?
I'm not exactly sure how microplastics can be addressed. I imagine that rain gardens and wetlands, as proposed by the applicant, if they're of a sufficient scale, then those contaminants would be captured and stored in those wetlands and rain gardens. So those treatment approaches are probably the right type of thing, but I'm not absolutely sure on that.
Okay, thank you. And my last water quality aspect is temperature. Water temperature running off urban areas. Have you seen the cross section showing the indicative planting of a stream, riparian vegetation?
Yes, I have, yes.
Information, yes. So I guess if that's all established and that grows up, would you be confident that that's going to assist with mitigating any increase in temperature and stormwater from hard surfaces?
That will help, yes. And again, the biggest concern with stormwater is that fast flow of water coming off roofs and roads. You can imagine in summer a rainfall on a very hot roof or road. The water coming off there originally will be very high temperature. Again, rain gardens and wetlands will help to slow the movement of that water before it reaches the stream where it might have effects, and so that would help mitigate those effects, again, if the scale of those rain gardens and wetlands is sufficient to do that.
Right, thank you very much.
Could I just ask you another question around the rain gardens and wetlands in terms of their effectiveness? Are they effective in filtering out nutrients, stopping the nutrients from then flowing into the stream?
Depends which nutrient you're talking about. Phosphorus,
Yeah.
Yes, phosphorus is often bound to sediment, and those types of control measures are relatively effective at capturing sediment. Sediment will deposit it and be stored in those areas. Nitrogen is another matter. It is not bound, it's in the water itself, and it's very hard to control. You will have seen the debate and challenges around nitrogen management, nitrate, particularly around New Zealand currently, and part of the reason for that is that it is so hard to control. It isn't really captured. What you need for nitrogen management is an large anoxic wetland where you get denitrification occurring, and yeah, you'd need special wetland conditions to have that occurring, and even then you can get that the treatment of nitrogen can be exhausted in those wetlands quite quickly, so it's a real challenge to manage.
And do you see high nitrate levels in urban streams compared with rural or forested streams?
Not as high, I don't think. No, but there will be some application of fertilisers on gardens and urban areas and nitrogen will be part of that. So yes, generally it's elevated, but I think the sites I've seen around the country that have the really high concentrations of nitrogen are largely associated with intensive agriculture.
Ms Tepania.
Good morning.
Morning.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for your evidence. I have a question for you, Dr. Young. In terms of your evidence, you talk about the loss of stream habitat. So I just wondered, what additional provisions would you need to see to satisfy you that both stream loss and loss of aquatic habitat can be properly quantified at the resource consent stage?
There's two elements. I was thinking about the potential realignment of the lower river. There's a potential loss in length, so I think any resource consent would need to consider the loss in habitat length there. I think it might be 30% or something like that. It's a reasonable reduction in length. The other areas that I'm most concerned about are the small tributary streams of Carcass Valley and in other parts of the country. There's rules for ephemeral streams that don't, I guess Carcass stream could be classed, the whole stream could be classed as an ephemeral stream, and that triggers various rules and plans, and ephemeral streams have been poorly protected in other parts of the country, put in pipes and forgotten about. So I think the principles in the Schedule X.9 talk about maintaining some of those natural waterways. It's not specific about how small that goes to, but I think there should be protections of those small ephemeral streams. They do have values, they do have biodiversity values. There might be some organisms that live in those areas and can cope with occasional drying, and I think those small ephemeral waterways need to be maintained and not put in pipes and forgotten about.
Okay, thank you. In terms of compliance with the NPSFM, you note that there is considerable uncertainty about how well these requirements can be met. And I wonder if you can just explain a bit more as to why that uncertainty, why you've got that uncertainty, and what sorts of things you would be looking for, you would suggest that we should be looking for to give us confidence that they could be met.
The primary uncertainty, I think, as I've said, I think the range of mitigation measures that the applicant has referred to are appropriate. They're aware of the potential risks, but I'm not aware of the effectiveness of those. There's a lot of talk about, as I said earlier, about application of best management practices. I would like to see some information on how effective generally are best management practices. Do they capture 90% of the concern, or in a big storm actually they are overwhelmed and are largely ineffective? Again, the scale of that, I was looking in the Nelson Tasman Land Management manual to see if there was any rules of thumb around the percentage of the catchment that you would expect to see in terms of wetlands or stormwater management. It may be in there, I may have overlooked it, but I would like to see maybe you've heard evidence from other witnesses on what the rules of thumb are around the proportion of a catchment that you'd expect to see in those sort of protective mitigation activities.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Just my last question, we've heard a lot of evidence from the community in the last couple of days in particular, and their concerns related to the water quality that will remain in the Maitahi River, but specifically around the swimming holes and their ability to continue to enjoy them. I'm trying to understand really, in terms of discharges from the Carcass stream, how that's likely to influence the swimming holes that are upstream, really. Not talking about Denny's Hole, obviously, but talking about Sunday Hole and Black Hole. So what really is the potential effect for adverse effects on water quality at those upstream swimming holes?
I think Sunday Hole is upstream of the confluence with the Carcass stream, so it wouldn't be affected. I guess the only influence there, if there was some degradation of the downstream habitat, there might be less fish moving upstream or something like that, but I wouldn't be too concerned about the effects on Sunday Hole. So you've got Denny's Hole, Black Hole, Gurley's Hole are the three main swimming holes downstream of the Carcass Valley confluence. What are the impacts on that if you had large-scale fine sediment losses that may occur during construction or post-construction coming out of Carcass Valley? You might get short-term deposition of fine sediment in those swimming holes. Given the morphology of the stream, I think those would be, the risk of them filling up with fine sediment is very low. I think the flow coming down the Maitahi will avoid that risk, but there is a risk of more of that fine sediment being within the gravels along the bottom of the river, in the swimming holes and in other parts of the rivers. But yeah, I guess I'm keen to point out to you that just if that sediment is flushed downstream, it's not out of sight, or potentially is out of sight and out of mind for some people, but I'm wanting to emphasise the ki uti ki tai kind of approach here. We should be thinking from mountains to the sea, and that sediment does go somewhere. It may not sit in the swimming holes and make them shallower or anything like that, but it does go downstream. It will be in amongst the gravels of the lower river. It will be deposited in Nelson Haven. It will be deposited in Tasman Bay, and it will contribute to the sediment issues in those areas that are already there.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers. Appreciate your evidence.
Thank you.
Dr. Young, a couple from me, and it may be a variation on a theme in a sense. And I think you clearly acknowledged that, there are two stages to this process, and the one that we are considering is whether, in the first place, this area should be zoned for a range of urban activities and urban zones and open space. And the corollary of that is we need to understand in that section 32 terms, is it appropriate, what are the appropriate provisions, as opposed to we're not here to design a specific proposal. And of course the applicant have provided some indicative plans showing how they might achieve that. And I think you've said you've seen these documents, and I was going to ask you a couple of questions on them. Do you want one of these in front of you?
I've been inundated with so many documents. I may not have seen the most up-to-date one, and there's different plans. I would like to see.
I'll ask Ms McShay just to hand you this one. This is the roughened Milne documents, and it's one that was handed up to us at the beginning. Just on page 12, I'll leave the page open that I really want to focus on the questions. Page 12. It's really the indicative Denny's Hole interface plan that I'm looking at. But it's more... Thank you. It's really a more general question, though, to inform us. And I think you've had a number of questions from the other commissioners about, that the Esplanade Reserve and the 40 is not a silver bullet, and this idea that it's not appropriate to locate the stormwater treatments in the Esplanade Reserve. And to Mr. Mark Brown, you said, look, you are more happy, if I can use that term, in sense that the way that the applicant has proposed something. But when I look at that indicative plan on page 12, and certainly the dimensions which are shown on the subsequent page on page 13, which are much wider than the 40 metres, and so there may be space there. But I suppose the question I have for you, do you consider, when you've looked at the proposal and the zoning, that there is adequate land, put aside whether it's zoned open space or residential that the applicant's wanting, is it your view that there would be adequate space there to design, you know, a wetland system or something that would satisfy your concerns, be it on some of that residential land if it needed to be? Because again, all of this will need resource consent to achieve it, i.e. really, can it be done, in your view? And again, I'm not asking you to talk about a specific proposal, but in your view, is there enough land space to do what the applicant's suggesting they would like to do in terms of those principles?
I probably have to defer to the urban design and stormwater experts on that. I'm not familiar with the scale of how big the scale of these sort of wetland areas need to be to protect the catchment. Obviously, this on page 12 is only the lower, the lower part, and so by the time the water's got in there, it's probably too late to deal with it. Presumably, the wetland here is only focused on, in terms of stormwater management and things, is focused on local stormwater coming off the urban area adjacent, rather than trying to address problems coming from further up in the catchment. That it demonstrates my point that, yeah, a ambulance at the bottom of the cliff kind of approach, just saying, well, this wetland at the bottom will fix all the problems, I would argue against that strongly, and I support the idea of a distributed network of wetlands. Whether this is large enough and whether there's enough scale, I don't think I can really comment.
Thank you for that too. So I suppose the question is, when you say it's not appropriate that they be in the Esplanade Reserve, and I think you said they could be elsewhere, I mean, in terms of that picture, there are other areas which are some of those other flatter areas which the applicant wants to be zoned residential. It simply may be, if it is zoned, that when they come to do a proposal, they might need to take some of that land for stormwater or water quality provisions. And I suppose that was really the question.
Yeah, I imagine that in this lower reach there is, given its topography is relatively flat, I think there is opportunity there to treat local concerns. My concern would be more up in the the steeper areas where the topography is quite steep, the ability to build or construct flat wetlands that might be used, or rain gardens and things that might be used. It would be quite difficult to do that. There aren't many areas, and that's where I would say I would have bigger questions about, is it feasible to construct these distributed areas? It's a great idea, but is that feasible? I don't know.
Right. Which kind of nicely segues into my other questions, is the one you talked about, you know, there are a series of principles which have been talked about, which you support those, but, you know, you still say, are they enough? And I know you're not a planner, so I'm just looking at it in a sort of a context. The way that the policies that Mr. Lyle has suggested, where he talked, this is in policy, and you don't need to go to it, and it's policy RE 6.3, Integrated Catchment Management Plan. He said the following principles will be achieved, and then there's a list. Is it your view that it should not be an exhaustive list, that it needs to somehow, in your view, to achieve the outcome, it needs to specify those, but clearly include others? Because we've been heard that, for example, to realign the stream, to do earthworks and all the things requires a resource consent where you have access to all of the objectives and policies of the plan. Is the difficulty the way it's expressed, that it seems to be the list? And would you support something which would enable a wider list?
I think I'm not exactly familiar with that rule or proposed rule. I think, yeah, the wider range of values need to be considered, and if that list goes towards constraining what is and isn't considered, then I think that would be a shortcoming.
Right, okay. And my final question comes to the idea of the realignment of the stream, and it's clear that the applicants would like to be able to realign the stream because that's the way the structure plan is set up. And as you say, the expert conferencing says there could be benefits from moving it, but there could also be ecological benefits from leaving in situ and leaving it in place. In terms of your expertise, then, what's your advice to us? Is it that in terms of the policy development or the policy that gets put into the plan, if it's approved, doesn't pick a winner in the sense that it doesn't say preference for realignment or preference for in situ, it talks about enhancement, restoration, protection, and if the realignment achieves that in a better way, then that might be the outcome through a resource consent, but it doesn't need to be predetermined? Or do you think there could be a preference for realigning it given the expert evidence that you've heard and that you've presented to us from an ecological perspective?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that there's substantial benefits in realigning it. There are some, as I mentioned earlier, there is that sort of bank which may provide a bit more shading in the channel where it's proposed to go, but on the other hand there would be disturbance of whatever life is in the channel now, wouldn't move across with the water, and there is a loss of stream length associated with the realignment, so there's some potential positives, some potential negatives, and I think what you were suggesting sounds better rather than saying there shall be a realignment. I think it's if there are some wins, if the balance of wins versus losses are higher by realigning, well, maybe that's appropriate, but if the balance is the other way, it's better to keep it where it is and enhance the habitat where it is, then that would be a preferable outcome.
Right. So short point in terms of what you've heard in your evidence, there is no compelling ecological reasons why it could be moved, but that needs to be assessed on a case basis. Okay, that's clear to me. Thank you very much. Ms. Reid, any follow-up questions? No. Can I just check, Ms. Stepanier, any follow-up questions from you?
No, thank you.
Mr. Mark Brown?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for your statements and evidence. Thank you.
Thanks.
Those are all of the submitters that we had for this first block on the hearing, but we're slightly early, and I'll just check, is Mr. McKee here? Yes. Would you like to present now, or would you rather wait until after morning tea? Happy for you to come forward now if you wish. Now would be good, thank you. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. I'm just bringing up the actual submission you lodged. I reread it again, or we all reread it again last night. So I'll hand over to you. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. We've got copies of my original submission have been distributed, and there are no changes to my original submission from the date it was done. Probably a little more evidence now to it, but I'd like to cover a few bullet points as per the edition that I've supplied. to this proposed plan change. Just some points that have arisen during the hearing. First one's current intensification development projects. I understand from Save the Maitai's, Mr. Peter Taylor, advised that there were currently 291 developments by way of intensification in Nelson City. He seems to be the only person who knows of this number, and it's certainly not apparent in any publications, and certainly not apparent to Bailey's Real Estate, that 291 developments are underway. I've driven around Nelson City and I can't identify anywhere near that number. As to Carcass Valley, it's certainly not certainly not a physical part of the single catchment as Save the Maitai submits. It is a discrete, separate valley with very little visibility to the Maitai Valley Road and the areas surrounding the cricket ground as an identification spot, but that very small area of the Maitai River that abuts Carcass Valley. As numerous submitters acknowledge, most of it is not recognisable from the road. As to intensification, the stated figures that have been produced by the local authorities, they expect 60 to 65% of new residential buildings in the next 3 decades to be intensified projects. This requires a massive shift in buyer preferences. I'm talking about buyer preferences for people that live in a city like Nelson. No current evidence of anything like that is certainly apparent today, and certainly not apparent in the buyer preferences of the buying market through all age groups. I would make an exception that if you look at the intensified projects, high-rise projects that have been constructed of a recent time, retirement projects or that age group are the majority occupiers. Ridgeline housing development. There's substantial ridgeline housing on the southern end of Prince's Drive, to give an example. Prince's Drive in Nelson, which everybody locally knows, on the western side of the city centre, is a very similar height to Malvern Hills, which are part of this application. At the Tasman Heights, which is the southern end of Prince's Drive, housing extends over both sides of the ridge. It is visible from Waimea Road and Bishopdale. I can speak from experience because I live on Prince's Drive, on the ridge line, on what I would call my house was built in 1959, so it's not in the new area. And my house is very difficult to point out to people. They say, "Where do you live?" I say, "See those trees up on the hill that have been planted since 1959? They obscure my house, the house next door, and a number of other houses." And I would challenge people to drive up from Moana Avenue along Prince's Drive to the new development. So in that gap before the new development of Tasman Heights, to see what replanting and natural planting does to a ridgeline. In fact, what is a ridgeline? Is it the visible ridgeline of which Carcass Hill, which I look across to from my place, is very much a lower ridge line. The skyline is well back and a substantially higher height. Looking round a city built on hills like Wellington, a very similar situation, that with planting that was not there for many, many years from early settlement, most of these areas were deforested and farmland, by putting residential housing, you naturally get landscaping, native trees planted. At my home, we have trapped possums. My daughter, over a year, trapped 12 possums. We feed the birds. We hear the birds. I woke up this morning to the tuis. And this is right in the city, closer than Carcass or Malvern. The bird life is there. Since the possums have gone and the rodents have been controlled, we've got a vastly increased bird life, even down into an area like the wood where I was yesterday. To stand at somebody's home in the middle of the wood, the bird life was magnificent. So planting and modern landscape architecture, which is far advanced today than when my home was built, is certainly a great benefit to the community and the environment. As to comparative costs, I spoke last night to a past president of the Master Builders Association in New Zealand, and I spoke to him about building costs today. And I'm talking about a basic home, a first home owner's home, of approximately 1,000 square metres. My home on Prince's Drive, when I bought it, and I did extend it, was 1,000 square metres. Sorry, 1,000 square feet, 100 square metres.
I was going to say, you've got a very large
100 square
house.
metres, yes, and I can't afford that. My first home that I bought in Wellington, some 58 years ago, was exactly the same height. 3 bedrooms, 1 toilet, 1 bathroom, a very comfortable first homeowner's home where we had 2 children, brought them up and gradually went up to a larger home. But it was very, very suitable accommodation. And there's nothing wrong with those homes that were built. And I remember selling property and being involved with the Beasley homes, which some of the older members would remember, who specialised in building first homeowners' homes or smaller homes suitable to smaller families or members of the public that families have moved on. Today, those homes are still reselling very quickly. There is still demand. The majority of new homes being built today are very much more highly specced than what I'm talking about and what there is a huge demand for in the marketplace. The cost to build a home today, a basic home, is $3,000 a square metre. Plus, this is in a duplex, so that's 2 single-storey homes joined, 2 of them on a section, 600 square metre section, $3,000 land cost on a flat site, gives a square metre rate of $6,000 per square metre, including the land. I then compare that to a high-rise apartment. Today, a high-rise apartment in Nelson.
Can you just tell what do you mean by high-rise? Are we talking 3 or 4 stories? What sort of?
Yes.
Okay. So needs a lift? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Okay. Yes. What's been built around the waterfront, been built on a number of sites in the city, like the Betts Car Park, which is very close to here. That is a high-rise apartment, or what the council are proposing on some sites in the central city. Those high-rise apartments today, and these are actual figures today, are selling for approximately $10,000 a square metre of land. So a 100 square metre, 2-bedroom apartment is selling for $1 million. There is a vast gap between $600,000 and $1 million. And I think we have to be realistic as to costs. And these are all selling costs that I'm talking about. So $600,000 and $1 million. There is a huge gap, and you can put some contingencies into that if you like. Play around with the figures. There is still a huge difference in cost. And the people that I'm talking about, the change in market, who is going to be able to afford $10,000 a square metre total cost for a high-rise apartment? Some yes, the majority no. There's also been some questions, or there has been challenges put to the hearing by the Save the Maitahi, STM, I say on my report, challenging Mark Lyle's expertise. I would, and this isn't to appeal to Mark Lyle, but I'll make a statement. I remember Mark Lyle being a young planner out of university working at the Nelson City Council. He was probably...
We might not need to go here. I think Mr. Lyle can talk for himself. I think what...
Oh.
Yeah, so he's thick-skinned enough, I'm sure, to know how these processes work.
That's all right. I accept the chair. Ngāti Kawata, who are involved with this application in the Carcass Valley and Carcass Hill, are involved with it and respecting it as part of their ancestral lands. The desire of Ngāti Kawata to express connection and to provide needed housing is very significant and should be respected. When mostly European opponents through Save the Maitahi are saying it is not here because we prefer open green space, I say paid for by somebody else. This is on Ngāti Kawata's and part of Ngāti Kawata's ancestral lands, that somebody has to pay for it, and it's going to be, they would like it to be open space. I question it, and I ask you to consider it. If Ngāti Kawata is to be denied this aspiration in respect of their land, and they are to remain dispossessed for another 150 years, question. Meantime, who has taken any steps for or to restore Carcass Hill until last year, when it was transferred to Ngāti Kawata? I can tell you now, for the last 150 years, Carcass Hill has been the greatest breeding ground for feral goats in the whole of the district. It's certainly divorced of any good plantings, of any bird life, anything natural at all, apart from possums, and they work in very well with possums and goats. It is great to see this ancestral land going back to somebody that cares for it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you, but can I start off? What we've heard a lot from submitters is this idea of intensification rather than greenfield, and I think you've covered that off. But given your role in Bailey's and real estate agent, can you give us a sort of a perspective of the need for what you think, the need for more greenfields land as opposed to intensification, and certainly what's likely, you know, in your experience, to be people who might want to buy in the Maitahi, in the Carcass Valley if it's proposed, or if it's approved. And just in the second part of the question, we've heard a lot of people say it's in a valley and it will get sun for some of the day, not all of the day, and it will be different in winter and summer, and therefore how desirable it is in terms of real estate. So there's a couple of questions in there. Well, what's the market telling you?
The market tells me and tells, well, the market says, market's telling us that there is not a huge shift from the young families and a significant number of the older people. So I'm talking about affordability to go into highly intensified housing. We're not big city. We haven't got those pressures, and we haven't got the change in mindset for families with young children to go and live in high-rise type of development. That's why people come to live in Nelson, because they have got that feeling that they can have green space, they can have a vegetable garden, they can have somewhere outside for their children to grow up, rather than in a public park or community-owned, I'm saying council-owned, reserves where you take your children away from home to go and play and have a game of cricket or kick a ball around, or even just to have a barbecue outside, rather than doing it on site. And I'm not talking about large sections. What a home today needs is privacy, which can be a courtyard area, the size of your living room, providing it's sheltered, it's planted, and it's got some privacy. It doesn't have to be a large site. There is still, and there's a huge move for people to grow their own fruit and vegetables. And
so
environmental...
Can I just step in? Because
yes.
you covered off affordability, which is
yes.
in the sense of, but in terms of market preference, I mean, if affordability wasn't an issue,
yes.
in your real estate view, so if costs were the same, and you're saying they're not, I accept that, would people choose intensification, or in your view, are people in terms of market preference still choosing to have a more, what I'll just call a suburban, might be close to the city, but a section or a house or a duplex?
Very much
right.
more a duplex.
Right.
Or a duplex or a single home,
right,
yes. Right. Something that's on the land, they can go outdoors.
Right.
Because people live in Nelson because of sun.
Well, that just take that into my last question. We've heard a number of them to say this is a valley and that the sites won't get sun all day. How does that impact...
Can I challenge that, Mr. Chairman?
Well, that's the expert view even, from the applicant. There are certain parts of the valley and the site that won't get sun all day. But it's more, you can challenge it, but the specific question I've got, how much in your view, given you've been selling in Nelson for a while, and Nelson's quite a lot of development, we've been told, is already in valleys, in terms of sunlight access, how much impact is that making in terms of market desirability, cost and people's preferences?
It is certainly an important factor, but to that end, I went up to Carcass Valley and stood in the sheds on the western side of the existing house in the middle of the valley, if I can describe it as that, and the sun was still there at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Now,
let me put you in a different way.
Those statements that have been made about the shade or any shaded aspect of that valley, the first thing is it's sheltered. So therefore you get more benefit of the sun. It doesn't get the sun until 5 minutes to 5 on the shortest day that I get at home, sitting on top of the hill. But it certainly got the sun at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So I would suggest that from 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock is very acceptable sun. Right. And with the shelter, and plus today, and the factor today is the insulation of homes. There are still homes that have been built right up the Brook Valley, which is very much a valley, with hills very close, that are well insulated, with very little sun, probably not much after midday, 1 o'clock, in the winter, but because they're insulated, they're still providing comfortable accommodation. And it's not the most desirable place, but they're not sitting there unsold.
Right, that's one. Thank you for that. Ms Tiffany, anything from you for Mr McKee?
No, thank you very much for your evidence, McKee.
Thank you. Mr Mark Brown?
Yes, please. Very interesting, your comments on the costs for infill housing, house versus high-rise. What about single house versus cutting a section in half and then building another house on it? Any idea on what those sort of costs would be?
Did you hear that, Mr McKee?
Not clearly.
Mr Mark Brown, can you repeat? I think you're asking if someone, added another house onto their site? Infill?
Yes. I'm just infill by way of dividing an existing section in half and then building another house on that section. Any idea on the relative costs per square metre for doing that?
Probably. The costs of building will be very similar because we'll talk about a flat site, in which most infill housing is, but and we can traditionally look because with the days of cross-leasing, there was substantial infill housing that has been built in Nelson. It's nothing new. But the costs of subdividing and the associated costs in servicing those sections, they've still got to be the same or dearer than what we're talking about, my duplex figures.
Right, so no less than 600 in your view?
Yeah, for the finished product.
Right, okay.
Okay, thank you. We had evidence from a submitter, an older woman who was living in a house and said she would like to move into a smaller unit in the city, but there was nothing available. So that's consistent with your experience. Is that, and why would that be? Why is there nothing available?
I would suggest they're not available because the properties aren't available to develop.
Yes, you had that in your evidence, that people aren't selling. And is that because they want to hold on to their big sections because that's what they like? Is that really it?
Well, some have got big sections, some are small, but people they have to have a reason to sell, and they're not selling just to make $1. They have people pass away, people have growing families, all those reasons lead to somebody selling. And that is just a natural progression, and because somebody says we could have a whole lot of infill housing, you've got to have people that have got those houses that want to sell them, and that has been going on for the last 30 years. There's nothing new.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Ms Rapp?
No further questions from me. Thank you for your perspectives. Very useful to hear from a person involved in the property market in Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, everybody. We'll take the morning break and we will come back, please, at 11:05. We'll reconvene the hearing, thank you, and Mr. Haye, I'm assuming, Fine Line Architects, thank you, welcome.
Kia ora.
Good on.
Kia ora koutou and good morning everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Ārime Commissioners for their time and patience to hear all of these opinions and important matters. My name's Matthew Haye, I'm Co-Director of Fine Line Architecture. I've lived and practiced in Nelson for over 15 years. My initial response to the plans to build the new houses in the Maitahi Valley is problematic. I do understand the housing shortage and housing affordability issues that we face in our community, as well as the shortage of diverse quality housing types. In the main, my problem is with the type of development that's being proposed. My interest in housing is from a professional point of view is to ensure that we're building the houses today that meet the specific needs of our community for the coming 50 years, and we're not repeating the building types that we've rolled out for the last 50 years. We face the challenges of decarbonising our economy, and building has a twofold issue involved that includes embodied carbon and operational carbon. Both need to be reduced significantly if we want to start combating the negative effects of climate change. There are obvious negative environmental effects of building the new housing development in the Maitahi Valley that include disruption to the valuable recreational area close to the city with the additional vehicular traffic. This type of green space would be the envy of other similar-sized cities around the world, and many are developing linear green parks while we are looking at compromising the assets that we already share. The stormwater runoff into the Maitahi River from both housing and the increased road traffic would jeopardise the ability to safely swim in this river, an activity that's been enjoyed for generations. You don't have to go far downstream into the suburban areas of the Maitahi to see that water quality erodes quickly. You also don't have to look far to see how suburban encroachment into recreational public space reduces the public nature of that space. Denny's Hole is a wonderful asset to our city and would soon become a space over the fence from someone's home rather than a public space shared by many on a hot summer's day. All of these things other people have spoken to, and I agree with them wholeheartedly, and these reasons to me would justify not approving the proposed plan change. However, it is the type of development that is proposed in the area that I want to speak to, and the possibility of doing development better in our region that I would see as the key message I'd like to deliver. Community-focused sustainable developments. The private developer-led proposal is in the main single or duplex housing lots on individual greenfield sites. This type of development is the most carbon-hungry and most cost-inefficient type of development we have. The level of individual infrastructure required to service this type of development is significant, and much of the infrastructure cost is borne by the community rather than the developer. I believe we should be pursuing development following the 20-minute city philosophy, in which all development should be focused on new housing being within 20 minutes of walking or cycling from all the amenities people would need, including schools, shopping and work. This leads to a pedestrian and cycling culture being developed with all the ecological, health and economic benefits that this entails. When looking at the development of within the proposed Plan Change 28, I see a lot of cul-de-sacs, I see a lot of garaging. This will lead to a community that's dependent on vehicular access to amenities and all the negative ecological, health and economic damage that brings. There have been many historical examples of development done that have looked at different notions of living beyond the American car-centric model. Starblock State Housing in Freeman's Bay, Auckland from 1965 is an example that developed four-storey buildings with large areas of green space around them with the aim of living within a park. Car parking was away from the buildings and clustered together, meaning roads and driveways didn't penetrate every area of the proposed development. We need to look beyond the business as usual type of development that's been occurring in Lower Queen Street if we're to consider giving up this green jewel of our city for additional housing. Benchmarks for sustainable development. If development was to take place in a successful Plan Change 28, then a very high bar on the type of sustainable development required would be essential. This should include benchmarked and measurable standards. I would advise the Commissioners and Council to look at passive house standards on insulation levels and operational energy consumption as a way of ensuring that development would have a net benefit to the Nelson community and physical environment. There's also Green Star and Living Building Challenge standards that can be considered as well. I would like all new building work to be established with an eye of what the world would look like within the next 40 or 50 years and beyond. The notion that the land involved would be developed merely to meet the building code would be very problematic, as this is a minimum standard and is a business as usual model. Anyone who has investigated and taken seriously the notion of climate change and the climate emergency can see that the business as usual model is not a viable option for us. Intensification, no more greenfield development, Nelson Tasman Future Development Strategy and the Nelson Tasman 2050 Urban Development Agency. The potential of the development to occur in a single unit greenfield development model of Lower Queen Street in Richmond is hugely problematic. If development was allowed under Plan Change 28, one way to develop it would be through community focused and led with an intensification and sustainable methodology. The Nelson Tasman Future Development Strategy led people to believe that there was a desire for intensification in the Nelson Tasman region. And most public submissions in this regard advocated for intensification to lead to any new development in the region. Guiding principles for development could look at independent groups such as Nelson Tasman 2050 on how to develop in net positive ways. The establishment of an independent urban design agency to lead and ensure that quality development occurs would further guarantee that the plan change and the associated negative environmental impacts on the local green recreational area close to town would be done in a way that would best benefit and enhance communities. Conclusion. It's in my opinion that the land is too valuable to develop for profit-hungry, single-unit, car-centric, greenfield, business-as-usual way. Our people deserve more from the design profession and the construction industry, and the people in the position to effect and ensure that this happens is in your hands. Let us act as good ancestors in this matter and leave this place we live in a better way than it was when we first arrived. Thank you for your time today. Feel free to be in touch with any questions. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you. I just checked there are questions. I've got some, but I'll come back. Mr. Mark Brown, do you have any questions of Mr. Haye?
No, thank you.
No, thank you. Ms. Tevenier?
No, I don't. Thank you very much.
Ms. Rhett?
You seem to have two issues. One is the location, and that's both in terms of the value of Carcass Valley as it is at the moment and the distance from the centre of the city. And then there are the design issues. I'm interested in why you keep making the comparison with Lower Queen Street. I mean, it's a very different site, and what I'm hearing from the developers is actually a quite different concept and an engagement with Ngāti Kauata as the mana whenua for that valley and some of their ancestral lands. So what is your rationale for that comparison with Lower Queen Street?
I guess the Lower Queen Street sort of epitomises the sort of what I would call low density car-centric version of housing that New Zealand seems quite addicted to, and especially in property development, developers seem really eager to continue to pursue. There's lots of examples around the world where if we build slightly bigger, denser buildings, we can establish more green space around those buildings. And if we remove the need for every single dwelling to have a car being able to be driven inside that building, then we can eliminate a huge amount of the hard surface that a development includes. And I guess that's where I use the Lower Queen Street as a sort of as an easy to understand for all of us, an example of that little hard surface casting brick development.
But are you saying that that's what you think is proposed for this location?
When I look at the site plan and see the number of cul-de-sacs, the number of individual units, and the number of the amount of hard surface that would need to be included in this development, that's what I see, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think a couple of questions for me, and really drawing on your architectural experience and probably understanding. You're probably familiar with, our role here is to look at whether it's appropriate to urbanise this area or not. And I know that various potential subdivision layouts and road layouts have been proposed. That is not before us at all. It's simply, should parts of the site be urbanised, how it then gets developed is a different process, and some of it's resource management and a lot of it will be building act stuff. And I just think about a lot of the things that you've been talking about in terms of sustainable design and all of those sorts of things. Do you understand that, that a lot of those will be dealt with under the Building Act and not under resource management?
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine it being under the Building Act. I'd imagine it being under the RMA, because that's where a lot of the planning considerations come. The Building Act just deals with the physicality, not with the overarching planning side of things. But yeah, I guess in a lot of aspects, I can see that if the development as proposed with these proposed subdivision templates that have been going around, I guess what I'm saying is that if that is the business as usual development methodology, I don't see this as a viable option for Nelson to go forward with.
And I think that's clear. So, and it's not my job or our job, if the development was proposed in the way that you categorise it here, would it be appropriate in terms of an urban environment if it was designed the way that you think it could be or should be?
I don't think it's a simple yes and no answer. It's more, if for some reason the plan change was enacted, it would be hugely important for these sustainable initiatives to be implemented. If I was to look at I don't know, it's going on a different subject, but the future development strategy for the region, when we talked in that setting, we really talked about this 20-minute city where if you can develop within that 20-minute walking, cycling region, you really do have the possibility to change the culture of a town. And you go into cities in Europe, and car use is the exception, not the norm. And that would be where I would be, if you could sort of hypothetically think of Nelson in another 50 years, that would be the type of Nelson that I'd be imagining.
Right.
And the problem with building is that when we build, these things stay around for 50 or 100 years. And so what we need to be doing now is making quality decisions, imagining ourselves in 50 years, not imagining ourselves making decisions today, because it's going to be quite a different carbon environment, it's going to be quite a different climate environment in another 50 years. So we've almost got to push ourselves into a kind of an imaginary scenario where we're making decisions today, but we're imagining that world that we're going to be in 50 years. And so I think that's the difficult part for you guys, is that that these decisions that you make today, as we look in a present lens, are potentially quite easy decisions to make. But if you put yourself into a position 50 years' time, these decisions may not be appropriate for Nelson, and that this space might be better to be, moved into carbon sequestering bush that's an asset to us. And then we, as a community, look to how we can develop this 20-minute city, and we can look at other parts of the city and work with council to actually imagine the city we want.
And that's come through clearly. I mean, you did raise the point about that future development strategy and this 20-minute city idea, and this percentage of land that would be a percentage of development that would be through intensification. Were you here when Mr. McKee from Bailey's was speaking?
I didn't hear his speech, but I did talk to some of the other people here about what he said in terms of And are you referring to him saying that people aren't looking for this type of
No,
living?
what I wanted to put to you is, in terms of these, as I understand the strategy that the council in the 2019 version has adopted, and I understand is coming through the draft, yet to be adopted,
Yep.
is a certain percentage is envisaged to be intensified,
Yep.
and a certain percentage to be greenfield. And
Yep.
what Mr. McKee said to us, there are really two aspects. There is choice and affordability. And I just asked him the question, if affordability wasn't the issue, because he was saying intensified is more expensive to develop. But if you put that aside and it was choice, he said, and he used young families, but he said a number of people would still choose to have that more, and I just use the word suburban, I don't mean anything by that, lifestyle versus intensification. Hence, your question, it seemed to be, it should only be this. And I'm just wondering, again, from an architectural point of view, about this idea of choice.
Yeah, and I think that the existing housing stock gives us that choice. And what we don't actually have in Nelson is quality intensification examples and buildings. So if I was to talk to Mr. McKee on that point, I would say that we've got a huge amount of suburban stock for those people to choose. We've also got a number of people from that younger demographic who are coming back from living in places like Holland and England and New York and things, who don't want that to mow the lawns and do the garden. We've actually got a shifting demographic, and I also think that this notion of choice is a luxury that we actually don't have anymore. You know, we're in a position where we do have a climate emergency. We've got wildfires in the Northern Hemisphere that are, 40 degrees in the UK and things like that. We don't have the luxury to continue to pander for the market that's wanting that nice to have.
So let me just round out. So your view is intensification should be required. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that greenfield, the business as usual greenfield rollout is hugely problematic to the future.
And that's what your evidence is. That's very clear.
Yep.
Thank you very much
Yep.
for your statement and evidence. Thank you.
Cool.
Ms. Vine is. Hello, welcome.
I hope, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you very much for the chance to be here to speak to you. May I have my power presentation, please? Oh, it's very good. Oh, thank you. Very efficient. All right. I'll begin. Do I have to click something? Is there a clicker? Here we are. I haven't done this before, so I'm just wondering how I do that. Oh, here we are. I've done it. Okay. My name is Caroline Vine. I have been a resident and ratepayer for several years in Nelson. I came from London with my family at the age of 7 and have loved and adored the Maitahi River ever since. I wish to voice my concern and deep opposition to greenfield development in Carcass Valley as proposed by the private plan change. Right. This particular area of the Nelson Maitahi River is incredibly valuable as a beautiful, quiet recreation space and has been treasured for many, many years by both locals and visitors alike, as it has a special attraction. It would be an irreversible and grave mistake on the part of the Nelson Council should this type of mass development be approved right on the banks of our much needed and beloved clean, fresh local swimming holes. How can this even be considered with all the concrete jungle areas taking more and more of our grass, trees and scenery in Nelson? I don't wish to live in an overcrowded place like Richmond with massive amounts of cars, streetlights, roads and buildings. That's why I love to live here in Nelson. I cherish the Maitahi as a green belt open space. I admire the green belts that have been preserved in Wellington near their city. Surely the council could learn from this example. What about the increased number of birds flying through from the Brook Sanctuary, creating a natural wildlife corridor into the Maitahi Valley? I can't imagine them wanting to fly into an urban zone full of bulldozers, heavy machinery, trucks and cars. The views of the river valley from the centre of New Zealand and from the nearby vicinity would be forever changed and lost if this change from a rural zone ever became a reality in this pristine environment. The vast increase in the amount of traffic and pollution and major changes in roading, bridges and infrastructure to allow this plan of a terrifyingly substantial housing proposal fills over 13,000 people on the Save the Maitahi petition with absolute horror and disbelief. Please do not continue to ignore so many shocked and saddened people who have for considerable time shown their very strong opposition to any rezoning from rural to residential in the Carcass Valley area. Many who signed the petition are ratepayers. Remember, the council was elected to represent our wishes too. Please listen to us and stop these plans from forever destroying another beautiful river valley. This is one of the last parts of Nelson to currently be spared from tons of concrete, bright road lights, and seriously disturbing massive amounts of building over the green grass and trees. Elevated levels of additional air and sound pollution would certainly result from any proposed subdivision in this currently quiet place. Please leave the river, the trees and the birds alone. Keep the Maitahi as a tranquil recharging haven for locals and visitors to enjoy and relax in. Currently, it is an extremely special place to watch the dark night sky and stars and moon and listen to the river and the birds. Many folk here rely on this part of our river for their physical and mental health, especially in COVID times when many are staying closer to home. It is presently a safe zone just a short distance from Nelson, enabling people to reach the healing and peaceful properties of the valley to recharge their batteries and get on with life. The beach is way too far for some to get to. We need the river for swimming, walking and biking. How can the council close their eyes to the beauty that exists up here right now? This will destroy the community. How will this proposal enhance the river or our city? How can the council continue to even brazenly consider any such idea after the complete rejection several years ago by the Nelson public of housing development up here in rural zoning territory? There appears to have been a lack of public consultation this time when the proposal was raised again. It seems the Nelson Council didn't carry out enough checks to see how many people were still opposed to any Maitahi development before any such idea was set in motion. Considerable numbers of low-income, elderly and disabled residents cherish the accessibility and availability of Carcass Valley and rejoice in the chance to relax up here. Please, I entreat you, don't spoil it forever for thousands of us. It is in our blood and we love it. It's one of the reasons many people choose to live in Nelson. So many people would be unable to still enjoy this part of the city in the same way if this were to happen. How are they going to manage any rezoning problems due to urban development sprawl and roading issues? How about the stormwater runoff and general household chemical cleaning products damaging nature if such mass building is ever consented? Will these issues not pose an adverse effect on the environment? How about the water quality in the river? Will it still remain swimmable, especially at Denny's Hole and Black Hole? It looks like an unsuitable building site in a cold, damp, steep flood zone area. Let's protect the river. It has no voice. It is a living entity like Pupu Springs in Takaka. It's part of Nelson's heritage and our legacy for future generations. Don't let the daily summer swims and joyful and safe walks and bike rides become just memories of a once idyllic and tranquil past. If you need to build, do it in the city, but not here in nature. Try to build upwards. Build more affordable apartment blocks for those in need of homes. Please consider the following slides as a visual representation of the beauty and tranquility of our Maitahi River. These are photos of Denny's Hole and Carcass Valley region. So the first photo is looking down from Carcass Valley into Denny's Hole swimming hole. The second photo is looking from Denny's Hole up towards the Carcass development area, which is on the other side of the river. These are taken, I think, in springtime. Another shot going from Denny's Hole up with the proposed subdivision land on the other side of the river. The next one is the cricket ground across from Carcass Valley. That round one with a little tree, blossom tree, has got a little beach, but the council helped me with the PowerPoint presentation very kindly, so the beach is cut off, but that's the kind of little places we can get to in that area near Carcass Valley. And that's a shot of Denny's Hole, the next one. And that's a shot of Denny's Hole looking down towards Black Hole, and that's more Denny's Hole enjoyment. I wish to just add something in my conclusion, if that's possible, and I can give you a written copy of it.
Thank you very much.
At the conclusion. Thank you. Yesterday, I drove home along the heavily flooded Lower Maitahi River path on Domit Street, off Nile Street, in the rain, and worried about the effects of any mass development. A proposal of 700 houses upstream in the Carcass Valley, should it ever be approved, is just so sad. As these extreme weather events become more frequent, powerful and destructive, we need to urgently protect the environment by respecting nature, not by felling many trees and carving up land with heavy machinery and filling it with concrete adjacent to the river. A site visit by the RMA commissioners, the council and the developers during rain would show the full impact on the area proposed for subdivision, and in my mind would be an important part of any consent decision. Not that I am an expert, but it seems to be a good idea. I've nearly finished. I implore you, as the independent RMA panel, to recommend that Council reject this application, please. The Maitahi Valley is the emerald in Nelson's crown. This river valley is the heart of our city. Please keep it rural. Last paragraph. Thank you for your time. I would like to thank the Council, especially, for helping me with my PowerPoint. Thank you to all the speakers who love the Carcass Valley and river as I do.
Thank you very much. Ms. Rett, do you have any questions?
No questions from me, thank you. Your perspective is very clear from your presentation. Thank you.
And the same from me again, very clear, adding to the comments from a number of other members. So thank you very much for your presentation. And Ms. Duncan, on behalf of Mr. Tasman-Jones, thank you. We have Mr. Thompson-Jones' submission in front of us, which I think you're going to read to us.
Tasman-Jones.
Oh, Tasman-Jones, sorry.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou. My name is Jennifer Duncan. I'm proud to be presenting on behalf of my partner, Mike Tasman-Jones, today. I will now read his words and I'll let you know if I skip any paragraphs and he'll send a written copy later.
Thank you very much.
So here is Mike. Tēnā koutou commissioners, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, ko Mike Tasman-Jones, tōku ingoa. Greetings commissioners, my name is Mike Tasman-Jones. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute to the hearing. My apologies that I'm unavailable to attend in person, aroha mai. My background, I served as Community Partnerships Advisor at Tasman District Council for 18 years until 2019. That role encompassed community recreation and community engagement. I'm a brook sanctuary donor and field volunteer. I also volunteer at community tree plantings. I run pest trapping operations on my own property. I regularly use the Maitahi Valley area for walking, biking and swimming. I also note the petition data provided by change.org states that I live in Christchurch, yet I've been a Nelson resident and ratepayer since 1991. This presentation has 4 parts. Firstly, I'll talk about aspects of the applicant's proposal that I support. Secondly, I'll discuss how the community has expressed its voice and how significant that is. Thirdly, I'll identify what I see as weaknesses in the PPC. Then to wrap up, I'll comment on a potential way forward that maximises positive outcomes. So part 1, aspects I support. The aspirations of Ngāti Koata, increasing their connection to the land, iwi housing, Kaka Hill in Ngāti Koata hands, restoration of biodiversity and planting on Kaka Hill and in Kaka Valley to support flora and fauna biodiversity. I support these positive aspects as outlined in the written statement of Mr. Toia. This is a quote, provide whānau with healthy homes, a secure home base for whānau social and economic development and a real opportunity for whānau home ownership. And there's a couple of other paragraphs cited from Mr. Toia's statement. Mike continues, I support riparian planting of sufficient width to support wildlife habitat, wetland health and hydrological health within the Kaka Valley, which the Nelson Tehera Biodiversity Corridor. I support public access through Kaka Valley by the addition of any reserve land. Mr. Greenaway has said the PPC would open up an area of inaccessible land. I note the plan shows open space recreation areas in southwest adjacent to Botanical Hill and a strip along Kaka Stream. At the upper part of the stream, the strip joins with the proposed road that runs along the ridgeline of the Melbourne Hills. And there's a footnote that has further information about that. Part 2, the community's voice. I'll now move on to discuss that. At this point, I would like to address a question by Commissioner Ratt to the effect of how can commissioners know that the community doesn't want this subdivision? So, discussing evidence of community opinion. In the absence of scientific polling data, a suite of evidence must be gathered, as much evidence as possible, and to check for consistency of results. That is, do all the pieces of evidence consistently point in the same direction? If so, one can then be confident in drawing conclusions from that evidence. In the case of assessing the community's opinion on the issue of rezoning in the Maitahi Valley, one can consider the results of consultations and petitions, the number of signatories to the Save the Maitahi petition, submissions to and speakers at this RMA hearing, the numbers of members of the public who have attended council meetings or emailed council to oppose development in the Maitahi, the ability of Save the Maitahi Incorporated to raise money to provide expert evidence and legal representation at this hearing, and thereby the willingness of members of the community to donate, and so on. It's crucial to note that in the case of this campaign, all lines of evidence point to the same conclusion, which is that there is widespread and deeply held view among the community that the Maitahi Valley should be protected from urban development. People have chosen to be involved. I want to stress the voluntary nature of the campaign to save the Maitahi. My partner and I are simply 2 people in the community who have felt compelled to voice our concerns regarding permanent and significant changes that would occur as a result of this PPC, which we, and evidently many others, find unacceptable. We've both had to step out of our comfort zones to do this, but it is something we both feel strongly about. It is not enjoyable, in fact it is distressing, and could have been avoided if full community engagement had been invited from the start. I would like to acknowledge the number and wide range of people who felt passionate enough about protecting the Maitahi Valley from urbanisation to put their heads above the parapet. So how do I identify the community in the case of this campaign? Still reading Mike's words, obviously. There is no doubt, this is no doubt not a comprehensive list, but I ask you to think about the answers to these questions. Who has come forward to speak at this hearing? Who came to fill the chamber, the foyer, the downstairs room and the overflow room and the street outside Nelson City Council to indicate their opposition to the proposed plan change? Who emailed councillors? Who wrote the hundreds of submissions to council at every opportunity in the last 2 years? The Whakamahere Whakatū Draft Nelson Plan, the LTP, the Nelson Spatial Plan, the 2022 FDS, which he notes is also called 2021 FDS, and now this RMA hearing. Who came to packed meetings at the Boathouse, at the Prince Albert, at Fairfield House? Who donated time, made the signs, displayed the signs on their fences? Who put stickers on their cars and letterboxes? Who are the people who wrote the flyers? Who delivered flyers? Who are the 1,000 people who joined the Facebook group? Who are the 1,500 people who joined the mailing list? Who wrote the newsletters, did the research, shared their photographs and stories, sent emails with offers of help? Who presented the petition to council? Who promoted the fundraising? Who donated $10, $100, $1,000, $10,000? Who are the people who contributed to building, writing and designing the website? Who donated prints, paintings, a rugby jersey, cycling gear, a smorg coin, signed books, or a percentage of their profits of other goods as fundraisers? Who held picnics in the Maitahi, held a cake stall? Who donated so many paintings that I lost count? And what of supporters who couldn't participate because they became pregnant, or had a baby, or had heart surgery, or experienced the death of a loved one, including ourselves? What of supporters who couldn't participate publicly because they didn't have enough time or energy? What of supporters who couldn't participate publicly because they found it so stressful that they couldn't sleep at night? And what of supporters who couldn't participate publicly in the campaign because of conflict of interest? I'm skipping a paragraph here. What is clear is that the community has made its voice and stance clearly heard during this hearing. Next section is about the large number of submitters in the Nelson context. There's been discussion at this hearing about whether the 715 submissions represents a large number of submissions. So therefore is this issue of concern to the community? Ms. Tapania suggested that 1,000 submissions might be considered a large number, but let's be careful to compare apples with apples. For valid comparison, I would seek comparison with a similar type of plan change request in a council area with a similar population. Fortunately, there is a very good comparison to draw upon. The plan change request to enable construction of 600 houses in the Marsden Valley, which is within the Nelson City Council area, just a few valleys south of Maitahi Valley. In the Marsden case, the RMA hearing attracted 19 submissions, with 5 at the further submission stage. This comparison tells us 3 things. Firstly, there is a great deal of community concern about urban development in the Maitahi Valley. Secondly, the 628 submitters opposing the Maitahi subdivision are not anti-housing or anti-residential development in valleys in general, otherwise they would have objected to the Marsden development. And thirdly, opposition to PC28 is based on the unique qualities of the Maitahi Valley and the value of the valley to the community. Part 3, what has the community said? The overwhelming key message is simply that Carcass Valley is the wrong place for housing. There's a clearly known and long-held community expectation that the Maitahi Valley should be protected from urban development. There are multiple reasons for that, which I'll briefly outline. Firstly, the site does not have absorption capacity. Mr. Lyle has said it has significant absorption capacity. I disagree because the rural landscape would become suburban. Urbanisation does not enhance natural character, and the values associated with the Maitahi River would not be enhanced by urbanisation. Secondly, the area is unique. Mr. Lyle said it's no different to many of the Stoke Valleys and Brook Valley that have been urbanised. The Maitahi Valley is totally different to Stoke Valleys and Brook Valley, none of which have sizable rivers with large swimming holes or the same number and mix of popular recreational destinations within them. Thirdly, PPC 28 does not uphold Te Mana o Te Wai. The sizable floodplain should be restored, not redesigned. Mike's included a diagram of the floodplain and notes that it was mentioned by Dr. Aaron Stallard in evidence on Tuesday the 19th. The diagram indicates the applicants intend to cut into the north bank of the Maitahi River, which I find unacceptable. Secondly, under Te Mana o Te Wai, the sedimentation risk is very high for all receiving environments, Carcass Stream, Maitahi River, Nelson Haven and Tasman Bay. Thirdly, stormwater and urban runoff would be discharged directly into Denny's Hole. And fourthly, large-scale earthworks would extremely and permanently damage the landscape values as described in evidence by Daniel Levy. So they were some notes under Te Mana o Te Wai, and then continuing under the Kaka Valley being the wrong place for housing, the next topic is that the PPC 28 constitutes urban sprawl. Mr. Nicholson said the term urban sprawl generally refers to expansion on the periphery of cities. Expansion on the periphery of Nelson is exactly what this PPC proposes. Another reason is, reason for not using Kaka Valley is loss of night sky. Urban sprawl would destroy the night sky amenity value of the area. And the next reason is noise pollution. Ms. Milligan described suburban noise well in her presentation. Commissioner Ratt mooted that if the swimming holes get very busy, surely they are noisy and that the proposed PPC8 might only generate comparable noise levels. While it's true that swimming holes do get crowded on very hot days, the sound of 2 or 3 dozen excited and happy children and teenagers splashing in the water and squealing in delight, while their adult companions grab the opportunity for impromptu catch-ups whilst floating in the river or sitting on the banks, is confined to the swimming hole area. Human voices are certainly not audible throughout the entire valley, as would be the sounds of motorbikes, cars, trucks, lawnmowers and other machinery and dogs barking, or any of the suburban noises Ms. Milligan described. Next reason is it's freezing. The area is renowned for being cold in winter with limited sunshine hours, as shown in applicant's evidence. So to wrap up, need another drink. During this hearing, we have all heard many valid points and perspectives from the applicants, from Ngāti Koata, Save the Maitahi and other submitters. There appear to be areas of agreement, including the desire to enhance the natural environment, meet housing needs, protect wildlife, provide for iwi aspirations, improve natural habitats, protect tranquility, provide access to recreation, promote mental and physical well-being, meet community expectations, and for community values to be embodied in the final decision by you, the Commissioners. The question then is how to accommodate as many of these widely supported aspects as possible, how to maximise the benefits while minimising the negatives. Firstly, I believe most submitters appreciate the need for housing. Under the existing zoning, it may be possible to provide limited housing while upholding the community's priority to retain and protect the unique open space qualities of the valley and to protect and restore the environment. Many of the negative impacts of the proposed subdivision scale directly with the number of houses to be built, so the impacts could be mitigated to an acceptable level by scaling back the number of houses from that proposed. What might a solution look like? A workable way forward would include revegetation and riparian planting, wildlife corridors, natural skylines, a healthy Maitahi River and peaceful recreation areas free of urban noise. It would preserve the urban-rural boundary, open space. It would meet iwi aspirations for healthy homes and a secure home base for whānau social and economic development through ownership of Kaka Valley under the current zoning that provides for housing while ensuring the rural qualities of the valley are maintained. This is a vision that I could support and that hopefully all or most members and groups of the community could support. With regard to what is actually on the table before us, the fact that so many of the positive and well-supported ideas presented by the applicants at this hearing are tied to a large urban development that would see many hundreds of houses built in a sensitive and highly valued rural landscape means that I cannot support PPC 28. From what has been heard from other submitters, it seems that many others feel the same way. I hope our community will find a solution that meets the needs of iwi and the aspirations of the many members of the community who feel so strongly about maintaining the tranquil rural nature of the Maitahi Valley, while enhancing the river, wildlife habitat and ecosystems that we all value so highly. Please decline PPC 28. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Duncan. We can't ask you questions because we needed to speak to Mr Tasman-Jones. I suspect I probably just need to correct one issue. I think the question about the additional noise that I put to Ms Milligan, I think I might have asked that question. I'm not sure that Ms Ratt did. And just to clarify, the only reason I asked it was that I think a number of people had said this area was tranquil and peaceful, and then we were getting a lot of statements saying it's highly used and there's lots of people and lots of cars come there. So I was really just testing that proposition, and of course the answer that came back from a number of witnesses was yes, but those are what you would expect from a recreational activity and we think those are appropriate. So I accept that was the response. So I don't think Ms Ratt asked that question on.
No, it wasn't me that asked that question.
Thank you.
That's my
I can
point.
get him to correct that. Yeah.
But thank you very much for the statement, and I want to thank all the submitters, and we're not finished yet, but I reread Mr Tasman-Jones' submission last night, and it was very comprehensive. I think it ran to 16 pages. So can you thank him on our behalf that it was a very comprehensive submission, and thank you for your statement. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much.
And the last submitter today is Miss Laputre, and I apologise if I'm pronouncing her name incorrectly. I'll just check, is she online, Tony, on Zoom yet?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. And did I pronounce your name correctly or incorrectly?
It was actually quite good. It's Laputre.
Quite good.
It was quite good.
Thank you. Now, thank you. We've got... thank you. We've got your statement, your expert evidence in front of us. So I'll hand over to you.
All right. Thank you. Kia ora and good morning, Commissioners. Firstly, thanks for accommodating me online. So my name is Karen Laputre and I prepared planning evidence for the Ministry of Education. I've read and heard about this plan change area accommodating a growing population and providing for a well-functioning urban environment. This is, of course, an overarching objective of the NPSUD. So I just want to run through the key points of my evidence because I do only really have one, and that relates to the role that schools and educational facilities play in achieving that well-functioning urban environment, and how the provisions of this plan change, which in this case would be Schedule X, can be used to recognise and provide for that need. As part of achieving well-functioning urban environments, there's a requirement under the NPSUD for Tier 1, 2 and 3 authorities, so that includes Nelson City Council, to be satisfied that additional infrastructure to service development is likely to be available. This additional infrastructure includes schools. The Ministry submitted that provision should be made for educational facilities within the plan change area, and through their further submission and expert conferencing, they specifically detailed what those provisions could look like and where they might fit into the proposed schedule. Those provisions are detailed in section 4.5 of my evidence statement, and they're also attached in the Ministry's further submission. Mr. Lyle and Ms. Sweetman both consider that the NRMP already provides enabling provisions for education. I respectfully disagree with that for two reasons. Firstly, Chapter 5, which is in Volume 1, and it includes the district-wide objectives and policies. There's nothing in there which relates to enabling schools or educational facilities or community activities. And similarly, in Chapter 7, which is the residential areas chapter, there's nothing in there either about enabling schools or educational facilities or community activities. And then secondly, educational facilities would be provided for as a discretionary activity within the residential zone. And I don't consider that to be particularly enabling, especially in the context of the absence of a supportive planning framework. I accept that Mr. Sweetman and Ms. Lyle are referring to a policy which relates to non-residential uses, and it could encompass a range of activities. That policy is not really specific to schools or educational facilities, and it's not really relating to supporting growth, but instead it's intended to guide the character of a neighbourhood. So overall, I'm of the view that the NRMP is not enabling in relation to educational facilities, and in particular in relation to residential growth. There is an opportunity to address this. The plan change is seeking to introduce bespoke provisions into the NRMP to ultimately enable this residential growth. And that same set of provisions can be used to give effect to the requirements of the NPSUD in relation to providing for additional infrastructure. The Ministry has assessed that the potential increase in people in this area might trigger the need for a new school, and those provisions are therefore important. The approach of enabling provisions for education within precincts or schedules as part of plan changes for unanticipated growth in particular is consistently requested by the Ministry across the country, and it's been accepted as part of other plan changes, including those in Selwyn and in Auckland, which I've recently been involved in. I'm also of the view that it's important to flag the potential need to the wider community, especially because the capacity of schools has been raised in a number of submissions. So overall, there's a substantial growth envisaged in this area that was not previously anticipated. There's a potential need for a new school, and Schedule X can be used to signal enable that requirement. This approach would also support the directives of the NPSUD in terms of requiring that additional infrastructure to service growth. That's really the crux of my evidence. It's a bit more detailed in the written statement, but if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that summary. I think what you put in your evidence is very clear what you're asking. So I'll go to questions. Ms. Tepanier, any questions from you?
I do have a question. Thank you very much for your evidence. My question is does the Ministry have some sort of threshold in making this requirement, and is it something that you've required in relation to other subdivisions that have been set up in Nelson in particular, rather than the Auckland examples you've given?
We haven't been involved in any, it's plan changes specifically where we try and get involved and really make sure there's enabling provisions. And it really has been more since the NPSUD coming into force and, giving that raised status to the requirement for growth to be supported by educational facilities.
I'm interested also in when you contemplate the fact that Ngāti Koata are part of the development team and the applicant here, in terms of the Crown's relationship with iwi and its obligations of redress, are those matters that have been properly considered by the Ministry in terms of its expectation of iwi?
That's not a process that I have been involved in to date. I know that when it comes to identifying sites and considering where there is a need for that, they start engagement with iwi and that those relationships are strong.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mark Brown?
Yes, please. I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. Good morning, Mr. Putra. My question is, does your discussion of education include preschools and kindergartens?
Yes, it does by definition include that. By definition of the NRMP, which defines educational facilities as including that. The NPSUD definition for educational facilities or additional infrastructure is not specific about whether that includes preschools, just refers to schools.
So the submission that you want the wording included in this Schedule X, is that included in the current version of it, or is it yet to go in?
The existing version includes a definition for educational facilities, which includes preschools.
So does it include what you have requested in your
Yes, it
submission?
does, because my submission asks for the inclusion of educational facilities.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mark Brown. Ms. Rat, anything from you? Mr. LaPetre, a couple of questions from me. I think in the expert conferencing sessions and more generally that I'm not sure a school is envisaged here, but put that aside for a moment. The Ministry of Education has designation powers. Why would a designation process, well, why would we need to put in these additional provisions when the Ministry's got designation power?
That is, the Ministry does have designation powers, and they do generally use that. I suppose there's 2 points that I can make about that. Firstly, territorial authorities need to have regard to relevant provisions of district plans when they're considering notices of requirement, and therefore when they came to assess a notice of requirement for a designation for a school, having that supportive and enabling framework in place is going to always be more helpful. Then secondly, not all educational facilities are provided by the Ministry of Education. So we do have private schools and special character schools, and they also contribute to meeting the demand for educational facilities within that network.
Thank you. That was the second part of the question. So as I understand it, most ECEs, early childhood education centres generally are not provided by the Ministry, as I understand. It might be licensed by them, but the Ministry wouldn't be designating those sites, I'm assuming.
No, that's right.
No. The other issue that you have drawn attention to is that Ms. Sweetman and Mr. Lyle didn't support putting these provisions in because, in their view, they were adequately covered in the wider plan. What's your view, and again, this has come up in other plan change hearings that I've been involved with putting sort of specific provisions into particular plan changes which therefore then don't apply across the entire Nelson region, and it's better that this issue is dealt with comprehensively once the full plan is reviewed. Have you got a view on that?
My view on that, I do have a view. My view is that there is an opportunity now to be addressing the need for a potential school in future here. So the proposal in front of us is a plan change that would enable a substantial amount of growth. And as part of the consideration of that growth, I think it's appropriate to now include educational facilities as a consideration.
Right. That's clear to me. Thank you very much. Thank you for your evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Those are all the submitters that were to be heard today. So I'm going to adjourn the hearing in a minute or two, but just thinking about the next day or so. Tomorrow morning we still have one submitter, Mr. Wheeler. It's the only day he could come, and then the council officers will present, and the list, I'm not sure Mr. Marson and others whether you've been told who might be coming back, but I've got a list here, and Ms. Day can correct me if I'm correct. So tomorrow we'll have Ms. Sweetman will do, the 42A author will do the introduction. We've got Anne McEwen in terms of heritage, Mark Georgeson transport, Mr. Gervin landscape, Dr. Blakely ecology, Mr. Ridley erosion sediment control, Mr. Fisher on water quality, Ms. Purdon stormwater and flood risk, Mr. Wilson water sensitive design, and then Ms Sweetman will do the planning issues. We asked Ms Sweetman to give us an indication of time. She's saying between 15 and 30 minutes per person. I imagine, just looking at that, some of the issues are not significantly in contention or they're relatively contained, so I imagine some of the council witnesses will take less time and some might take more. So, but I'm expecting it's sort of several hours, Ms Day. Down and across there. Yeah.
I'll just try that. Sorry, just with regard to the presentation by David Wheeler, first thing, they've actually withdrawn. So they won't, they've withdrawn, so they won't be, they're unable to attend the hearing tomorrow, and so they won't be here.
That was Mr Wilson, did you say?
Wheeler, who was the last
submitter. Thank you, Mr
Apologies.
Wheeler. All right, thank you very much for that. So we don't have any submitters tomorrow, so we will start at 9 o'clock. I understand that all of those experts are intending to produce something in writing. Some of that may be available today, and if we get it through, that we'll make sure it's on the website and circulated. Some might be presented tomorrow. So I'm expecting it might be a full morning of those people. All of them are going to be here in person, I understand, other than Ms Sweetman, so they'll be here for their presentation and for the panel to ask them any remaining questions. And then, Mr Marston, I'm just confirming, so, and then your reply that you've asked you to do in writing, which I'm very happy to accept, but will you want to make any concluding verbal comments, or will we just will I adjourn the hearing once we've heard from the council?
We've discussed that, and Mr Toyer will close off for us in terms of that's appropriate tikanga.
Yeah.
And there were some issues particularly that I think he wanted to vocalise. But the formal written legal submissions, the reply technical evidence, and the final set of offered provisions will follow in a week's time.
And we'll discuss that time tomorrow. I mean, it was more an issue as, do we fly out on Friday or do we stay on?
No, I think you fly out on Thursday evening.
If we could, yes, if we can.
But I won't be, because I'll be doing other things to help the team get that response.
Look, that's all. That's fine. Thank you. We'll deal with that. Given that Mr Wheeler is not coming tomorrow, and therefore we've heard from all of the submitters again, I want to thank all of the submitters again. I've already talked to Ms Duncan about that. Just the amount of time and effort that goes into submissions is significant. I understand that. I also want to thank, I know it's not over, but I want to thank those submitters who've managed to sit through the whole hearing and have heard it, and I assume you'll come tomorrow. So given that we're not going to hear from any more submitters, thank you all very much for your submissions. Right, we'll adjourn now. We'll start tomorrow morning, and we'll be hearing from the council officers, those people who have written that section or have contributed to that section 42A report. Thank you, everybody. Bev.